In this lesson, we're going to be doing an exercise where we're going to be saving some JSON data as a string into the session storage and then picking that information back up and outputting it into our web application. And we're going to also be parsing out that JSON string and outputting it into a readable format. So first of all, let's set up a form. And we're going to have a form that's going to input information. So let's create a few input types. So input type text and give it a name. So this can be first, or this can be first, the name of it can be first, and the value, and let's give it a value. And let's just line break it. So it's going to be a really simple form. I'm not going to do anything too elaborate with the HTML. So we can add in, maybe we can set up 3 different values here. So we'll do first, last, and company. And then update the values, so don't always have to constantly enter them in. And of course, if you're setting up a form, you wouldn't be doing it this way. You wouldn't have the values already in there. So this is just for demonstration purposes. So the next thing we need is a way to submit the form. So the idea is that once we submit the form, then we're going to save it into the session storage. And we're going to take this information, we're going to turn it into JSON format, and that's what we're going to save. A stringified version of it we're going to save, and then we're going to pull that stringified version out whenever the page loads, and then output that content. So let's do a value here for submit. So there's our submit button. So really simple input form here. So we submit it, it will submit all of this content. So next, let's hook up the JavaScript. So first of all, we need a way to grab that form. So we can just create a variable. We'll call it myForm. And we'll grab document, get element by ID. And we're going to grab the entire form. So the entire, we need to give it an ID, of course. So if you want to grab something by an ID, you definitely need an ID in order to select it. So let's grab it as myForm. Next thing that we need to do is let's set up an event listener. So we've got the myForm. And we're going to add an event listener. So add event listener. And the event listener that we're going to be listening for is the submission of the form. And whenever the form gets submitted, then we're going to fire off this function. And within this function, so the first thing we want to do is prevent default. So this is going to be a JavaScript method that's going to prevent our form from submitting. So whenever I go over it and refresh, and we need to pass the event object. So whenever we submit the form, nothing is going to happen. And we can fire off our JavaScript. So what we need to do is grab our data from our form. So let's set up a variable to hold that data. And we're going to do a function that's going to return back the form data. And we'll pass in the myForm information so we don't have to grab that object again. And then what we'll do is we'll console log out that data so we can take a closer look at it as it gets returned. So we're calling out to a function. So let's set up that function. It's called form data. And we're taking in the form information here. And so this just saves us that of having to get that object again. So we're just passing it all within that function so that we can easily look through within the function and grab that information. So let's grab out our form elements. And we're going to do a query selector all. So grabbing it off of the form. So going into that form object, query selector all. So it's only the submitted form that we're going to look at. So in case you have additional forms or you have anything else going on your page, this type of coding will be a little bit more flexible. And we're only going to grab the ones that match this criteria. So we're grabbing all of the elements that are query selector all, and that's what we're going to be grabbing. And let's just return back that object and see what happens. So let's refresh, submit. We get a node list of 3. So we're grabbing all 3 inputs. So just like that, we're able to grab out all of the inputs. So far so good. We're able to select that information. And the next thing to do is to create it into a JavaScript object. So we saw earlier the way JavaScript objects work. So let's create some of those. And we need to have a main container. So I'm going to just create one called myData. So this is where we're going to hold our JavaScript object. And now what we need to do, the next step is we see that we've got this node list. We've got the 3 inputs. So we've got to loop through all 3 of those and get the value and the name out of those, as we don't need the rest of that information that's contained in there. We only are after 2 pieces of information that's contained in here. So one of them is the value. So we're looking at the value, and we also need, for an object, so they're paired values. So we need a name and we need a value. So those are the 2 that we're going to use in this object to return back as a JSON formatted. So we're going to loop it while x, so we know that we've got a length of the elements. So all the elements that we selected, we're getting a length there. And now it's just all a matter of just simply looping through those elements and placing it into the myData. So now let's get the myData, and we need to specify a name. So I'll break this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. So the name will be, so this is, remember again, because this is an object, so we need these named paired values. So we have a name and we have a value for each one. So the first thing that we need is we need the name. And as we're looping through the elements, we're grabbing the element X that matches the loop, and we're just grabbing, not the value, we're grabbing out the name from it. And then over here, we need a value as well. So those are the 2 things that we need within our object. So here we can grab out that value. So let's console log out this information. So name and value for now. And then we'll show you that once we get that information, we can really easily translate it into an object. So we see that we've got the name and we've got the value, the name and the value. So it's starting to look more and more like the object that we're trying to build. So this is ideal. And we know that when we are creating JavaScript objects, we have an option to do it. So we can do it within this format where we do something like first, and then whatever, we could assign whatever value we want to it. So we can do it within that type of format, or we could do it within the bracketed format. So let's do that, where let's assign the myData a value of the value that we've got over here. And instead of first, we already have that name here. So we've already got that value for the variable. So we can make use of it in that type of format. And then over here, let's return back that myData. So refresh, submit, and there we go. So as we loop through each one of the elements within our input field, and so this is totally dynamic. So the good thing about it is, if all of a sudden you say, okay, well, I need another input here, and maybe this one is email. So notice I'm keeping it as type text. Otherwise, I could add in emails there as well. So for now, let's just do it that should be test@test.com. And by the way, not my real email. So this is just a test email. So we can see that our form is completely dynamic. So the more inputs we have in our form, the more gets added into our JavaScript object. So perfect. It's exactly what we want to do. We can get rid of that console log now. So what I want you to do now, pause the video and build this out for yourself. So start by just exactly what we did, creating a form, create some random inputs. Don't forget to give it an ID so you can select it. And you don't need to give IDs to the inputs because we're just grabbing them. We're looping through all of those elements that have the input text. And if you're doing different types, don't forget with the query selector all, you can comma separate it out and you can grab the different types as well. So the next thing that we did over here is we grabbed the myForm element. So we're grabbing that whole form as an object, and then we're passing it into our function. And in the meantime, we've also added that event listener over here. So this event listener gets added to myForm. So basically what happens is whenever this form gets submitted, that's when we catch it. That's when our trigger triggers all of our JavaScript functionality. So that's what we're waiting for. We're waiting for someone to click, trigger our function. We prevent the default action, otherwise we move to another page. So we don't want to have this page refresh or going to another page. We want to stay on our current page. We can get rid of our data there as well. Or actually, let's just keep that for now, because what we need to do is we're going to have to stringify this in order to save it as a session value. So we're going to keep it in there now. So all we've done over here is we've set up a variable and getting the return value from the function form data. Over at the function form data, we're grabbing all of the form information that we've passed through. We're doing a query selector on that form object, and we're grabbing all of the inputs that have text. We're setting up a blank object in order to deposit some information in there. We're looping through all the elements. And then as we loop through the elements, we're grabbing the name and the value, and then we're populating the my data with the name and the value. And basically that's building out our JavaScript object. So notice that it's not JSON, but JavaScript objects, as we learned earlier, there's a close relationship, and they're really easy to kind of bring into JSON. And the more familiar you are with working with JavaScript objects, the better off you're going to be when it comes to JSON and working through all of that JSON data. So try this out for yourself, build this out, and I'm going to show you the next stage that we're going to build out coming up in the next lesson. I'll show you how we're going to complete this, and we're going to be submitting this as a session variable, as just one variable. So we don't have to have different variables for each one of these form inputs. We can have it all in one chunk. And that's the most ideal way to do it, because we want as much flexibility in our form as possible. So coming up, I'll show you how to conclude this exercise.